about histamine, but before we go back into that a little bit, every question that I had, or most of the questions, involved how do I get this test run and how do we find somebody that could go over it. Now there are a number of people that are as qualified or more qualified than myself to go over this test with you. You just have to find them. It's just, as I will explain, when you start talking about genetics, many practitioners will say, oh yes, we need to run the MTHFR. Have you heard of that before? Right? MTHFR is one gene. It's actually two genes that were first researched. They have maybe more research on those two genes than others, but there are literally Facebook groups that are MTHFR Facebook groups that are all about MTHFR. Like that is the end-all be-all gene. We haven't even mentioned that gene yet. And we are only a teeny wee little bit through this that I'm never going to finish in this time. But, so though the MTHFR gene is important, it's a gene in the folate pathway that we haven't gotten to yet, it is a small little fish in a great big pond. So there's a lot of practitioners that will just run the MTHFR, and the patient, we get patients literally calling us every week or emailing me saying, hey, I have the MTHFR 677 homozygous defect, oh my gosh, I'm gonna die, you know. Okay, what are your other genes? It's so important to look at the big picture. With anything in health, you have, the farther you can stand back and look at the picture, the better you're gonna get. You have to look at everything. So the more conclusive you can get, the better. We don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. Does that make sense? So as much as I'm going to emphasize genetic testing, I'm going to emphasize that we look at as many genes as possible. And genetic testing is not everything. It's just a piece of the puzzle. And like this, are you a practitioner or a patient? A pediatrician asked a question about the gene defect that he had, and is this a significant defect or not? The research literally is coming in on a daily basis on this stuff. So as we get more research, we continue to add it to this profile. But just because you have genetic defects doesn't mean you're doomed. And just because you don't have genetic defects does not mean you're not going to have issues in that pathway. So environment trumps everything. So, as we'll see that. Now, if you decide to utilize my services in this, you have to go to my website, and I have some slides on this at the end, but I doubt that I'll ever get to the bottom of that, my slide presentation. But you go to my website, go to the genetic testing tab, and you'll see a whole bunch more videos to help educate you on what genetic testing is. Again, you have to run the 23andMe first. So if you want my help, we have to start with a case review, and that's done over the phone or over Skype. So I do genetic reviews for patients that aren't my full patients. So they don't have cancer, they don't have Lyme, or they're not coming to me for that, and they just want a genetic review. They're getting treated for whatever thing that they have going on with another practitioner, but that practitioner doesn't understand the genetics. This is a lot of hours of educating yourself to learn this stuff, so don't get mad at your practitioner if they don't really know this stuff real well. So it's so we do genetic reviews for doctors, for patients of other doctors as well. Those are all done over the phone. Even if you lived across the street from my office, we still do genetic reviews over the phone, so it doesn't make any difference where you live. So we start with a case review, what's called a consultation, or we call a case review. You have to send in paperwork. We go over your case. That's about a half-hour appointment where I'm talking to you, going over your case. You run the 23andMe. You send me your username and password. This is all on our website, so I'll write this down. You send me your username and password. I pull off the raw data. I send you what's called a SNP report. SNP is a single nucleotide polymorphism. That's what these gene defects are. And so I send you a SNP report that's over 30 pages long, and you'll go, oh my goodness. We'll go over that though. And we set up a time that we go over that on the phone. Okay? And then from that SNP report, I give a recommendations, some dietary recommendations, and some nutritional recommendations. Like I said, some of these SNPs, some of these defects are easier to support from a nutritional standpoint than others. Does that make sense? So we have some patients that's the easiest, that's the least expensive way to start with me if you wanted to be a patient of mine, is just to do a genetic review. You don't have to travel to Minnesota. We have patients from all over the world. So all of it's done via Skype or telephone and email, and you get that information and you walk through it. Now I can't give you recommendations based upon your cancer or your Lyme disease, or I can only give you recommendations based upon your genetics, because I'm not doing an examination on you. So, but this, you're going to see, this makes a big difference. Does that help? Yes. All right, so now back to what we're talking about here. Histamine is an important gene. This HNMT gene, like this person in this slide, does not have a lot of HNMT gene defects. But they still might have a lot of inflammation, systemic inflammation, even though they don't have any defects in this pathway. Why? Because they have environmental things that are causing this inflammation. Remember, histamine is a product of an immune response. Histamine is made by your mast cells. And in the presence of an antigen or an allergen, you're going to produce a lot of histamine. So when I have an allergy to pollen, I'm producing a lot of histamine. That's why I have the symptoms. Now, normally, if you don't have any HNMT gene defects, these genes should be working correctly, should be making the enzyme that breaks down histamine and gets it out of your tissue so you don't have quote-unquote allergies. Does that make sense? But if you have a hyperexposure to an allergen, or you have an autoimmune disease, or you have an antigen that's present constantly that you haven't identified nor gotten rid of, you have this ramped up immune response that's firing all the time. So you have excess histamine. So even in the presence of no genetic defects, you can still have a histamine problem. Follow me? So if the patient has symptoms of hyperinflammation, systemic inflammation, you want to look at, from my perspective, you want to find out why first, right? Why does this person have systemic inflammation? Do they have an autoimmune issue? Do they have an immune system that's constantly turned on? Do they have an antigen that's present? Do they have HNMT gene defects? So again, it's one piece of the puzzle. But if I have a patient that we're only doing a genetic consultation and they have a whole boatload of defects here, they're going to have, most likely have issues. So systemic inflammation issues can range from, headaches, chronic, go on with a list of symptoms a mile long. So I'm going to give you an example. I had a mother and father come with their young girl who had ADD, ADHD. This kid was literally bouncing off the wall, and I'm not kidding you when I use that phrase. Already gluten-free, already dairy-free. We did a genetic test. We did a 23andMe on this child. She had both her HNMT, I think she had a defect on every one of these genes but one. And she also had multiple comp defects, which we're going to talk about down the road, which affects the neurotransmitter dopamine. So she had excess dopamine because of the comp defects, excess histamine. So we put this child on a low histamine diet, and we cut out proteins as well, because proteins are going to be the precursor for dopamine. So we cut out the precursors for dopamine because they had excess dopamine, and we cut out histamines in the diet so that we would not continue to feed this cycle. The parents called me several days later saying, "We have a completely different child." And she said, "No, you don't understand. We've never seen her before like this. She's a different human being." I had a Tourette's syndrome child. Tourette's syndrome is where they can't stop blurting out expletives. because they have excess dopamine in the left frontal lobe, which is where your Broca's area is for speech. And with that excess dopamine, it's a very excitatory neurotransmitter. It just builds up and they just have to express something. That child had a very similar genetic variant picture. Did the exact same thing with them. Cut way back on proteins, which are feeding the dopamine picture, and cut off histamines. The mother contacted us 2 days later, said that the Tourette's was down 80%. So you can make a tremendous difference in a person knowing what their genetic picture is. Does that make sense? So don't take this lightly. You can see dramatic changes in people. So why would you, this is HNMT, which gets rid of histamine in the tissues. There's the pathway. Histidine goes down several pathways. This is a low histamine diet sheet that we use. That is assuming people are on a paleo diet already. And we send this to people. Things that are in the gray area are higher in histamine. Those are the things you want to cut out or decrease or eliminate if it's really bad. So anything that's aged has more histamine. Eggs are in there in the gray area. Eggs have histamine in them. The more aged the eggs are, the more histamine they're going to have. If you have your own chickens and you're eating fresh eggs, they have a lot less histamine. Even leftover food has more histamine than it had yesterday. So fermented foods that are so good for your gut, why are they so good for your gut? Because they contain so many probiotics, also have a lot of histamine. So I said, we can't use fermented foods with a person that's got a lot of HNMT and ABP1 defects. Okay, so we have to use other things. Does that make sense? We have to also be careful with glutamine, because glutamine is very good to heal your small intestine. A lot of products have glutamine in it. A lot of gut healing products have glutamine in it. Our product that we created has glutamine in it. But you want to stay underneath a gram of glutamine a day. Especially if you have cancer, because glutamine can feed your cancer. In some people that have a lot of GAD defects that we'll talk about later, and other GLUT defects, there's multiple glutamine genes. You want to stay away from glutamine altogether. Okay? Still following me? So I know it gets kind of complicated. It does. But it's complicated. There's just no other way to put it. You have to look at the big picture. I just wish it was like, okay, just stop eating this and all your problems are going to go away. It just doesn't work that way. So you have to look at this puzzle of our body and look at it as a puzzle, and there's a ton of different pieces, and if you could get the majority of the pieces, you can see what the picture is. The more pieces you can put in there, you can get a better idea of what the picture looks like. We're never going to be 20 years old again. We're always going to have degeneration. There's no getting around that. We live in a fallen world, but the more pieces that you could get put together, you can get back to the level of health that you're comfortable with. The next genes that we look at are genes that have to do with energy production. It could be said that the biggest health complaint of people is lack of energy. There's been studies that show that. That's a common issue with my patients. It's probably the most common issue with Lyme patients. I don't have any energy. I have fatigue. So how do we make energy? Well, you make energy through certain pathways in your cells, in your mitochondria of the cells, that produce ATP. So, if you've heard me lecture before, I said you have several life goals that you don't even know about. One of them is to make ATP. That's one of your life goals. ATP is a little chemical compound that gives your cells energy to do different processes, to run different functions, to push metabolic pathways, and to give you energy to make you feel awake. So ATP is essential. There are genes that help you, that make enzymes that help you absorb nutrients. We talked about those, your FUT2 genes, etc. So we need to look at that first. That's why that's first on the list. Are you getting your nutrients in your body? Let's say we heal our gut. We get rid of all inflammatory products. We're eating a really good diet. We stopped eating junk food. We're off of genetically modified garbage. We get rid of the pesticides and herbicides and stuff in our diet. We're on a low inflammatory diet. We're eating really good food. We're taking really good nutrients. Why am I not healthy? Well, those nutrients circulate through your bloodstream. They have to get inside the cells. How do they get inside the cells? These genes here. So that's what we're looking at. Because if we can't get those nutrients inside the cells and get them to create energy, well, we're still toast. It's not going to work, right? So we make energy through the Krebs cycle, through glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, the fatty acid chain, and electron transport chain. That's what these genes are. These are your carnitine genes first. There's a lot of genes in there. Does this person have a lot of defects in those genes? A fair amount. But you'll see people that have chronic Lyme have a whole mess of gene defects in there. They can't even get the nutrients across the cell membrane to get them into the cell. If you can't get the nutrients across the cell membrane to get into the cell, to get into the mitochondria, they're not going to work very well. And here it brings up another point. Some people will say, well, I have Lyme, and it's just disabled me. I've had it for 5 years, can't even function anymore. I'm laying on the couch all the time. I've lost my job. But you're asking me to do a genetic picture that I was perfectly fine 6 years ago, and I had the same genes. Well, I've been doing this long enough that we're going to see certain patterns. With really sick people, you're going to see certain patterns. Matter of fact, we did a Lyme study that if we get through this presentation, it's at the bottom of this presentation, where we had, I can't remember, 100 and some Lyme patients that went through this study, and the familiarity that we had with specific gene defects with those Lyme patients, these were all chronic Lyme patients, was really telling. And I can see a genetic profile, I've done this enough, and look at it and go, wow, this is a cancer patient, or wow, this is a typical Lyme patient. Now, I'm not saying that a particular group of genetic defects is going to lead to Lyme. Lyme is caused by a parasite organism, a pathogen, that you have to be exposed to. However, the difference between Sally, who has debilitated with chronic Lyme for 5 years, and her next door neighbor, who, let's pretend, got the same bite from the exact same tick, the exact same virulence, both people started with the exact same health record up to that point, let's pretend, and the neighbor took 2 weeks of antibiotics and recovered, and Sally's still struggling after 5 years, you really want to look at those two people's genetics. So if they have genetic defects in their mitochondrial pathways that we're going over right here, if they have genetic defects in their gut pathways, if they have genetic defects in their SOD detoxification pathways and stuff that we'll go over, they're going to have a more difficult time dealing with a pathogen than if somebody did not have those genetic defects. Does that make sense? Question?
If you're having trouble getting your nutrients, could it affect your iron, if your iron levels to be pretty low?
So if you're having trouble getting your nutrients, can it affect your iron and your iron levels? You're getting ahead of the game.
I was curious about the genes, what you're saying.
Yes, so there are genes that affect your iron ability to hold iron and holding too much iron and iron oxidation, which is a whole other piece of the puzzle. So one of the statistics with the Lyme patient group was that they have a tendency to iron oxidation. That's down on the list here. But yes, so their iron isn't even working in their body, so they have symptoms of anemia. even having normal iron levels or even high iron levels. But the iron is oxidized, therefore it can't get into the cells correctly. Still with me? All right. So here's some of these genes in this mitochondrial pathway. This ACAT gene is maybe one of the most important in this pathway. So this person only has a couple defects on there, but a lot of my Lyme patients have defects throughout all those. They can't make ATP very well. And again, I had these genes when I was 6 and I used to play t-ball and do everything and run around everything. Yeah, it's amazing how your body can deal with defects. Now you add an environmental insult on top of that, and it's the straw that broke the camel's back. Does that make sense? Whoa, what happened there? Whoops, hold on. So these are other mitochondrial genes that you need to address when a person has fatigue. And again, if I was dealing with a healthy person, these are your NDUFS genes, other mitochondrial genes. If I was dealing with a healthy person and they are doing a 23andMe profile, and let's say they had a smattering of gene defects throughout this, like this person, right? I would say, do you have fatigue? And if the person goes, I don't have any fatigue. I can get up and go. I wake up at 5:30 in the morning. I'm go, and my wife has to remind me to go to bed at 10:30. Well, then I wouldn't support them. Do you understand? So in my book, there's some genes, regardless of whether you have symptoms, that you should support. And there's some genes that I would only support if the patient had symptoms. So these mitochondrial genes I would only support if a person had symptoms. And understand I might change that theory down the road, but that's where I'm at right now. The FUT2 genes, I would tell that patient they need to support regardless of whether they have symptoms. Does that make sense? Because you might not have any symptoms of your gut. Remember, the only neurological fibers that you have in your gut are pain fibers for distension. So if you're not getting distension in your gut, you're not going to have symptoms. But you can have all sorts of inflammation. So FUT2 genes I would definitely support. These mitochondrial genes I wouldn't support unless the person had symptoms. But they could be a telltale of why a person has this chronic fatigue. Now there's other things that are going on with chronic fatigue, not just the genes of getting energy production out of the mitochondrial, right? And that's when we get into detoxification pathways that are so important. These are more mitochondrial genes that we look at. So there's a lot of genes to look at, right? Detoxification with cancer and chronic Lyme is essential. So I said earlier that you really are what you absorb. You're not what you eat, you are what you absorb. Well, actually better is you aren't what you absorb, you are what you do not detoxify, right? So you absorb a lot of things, not just through your gut, but through your breathing or through injections and things like that. If you can get it out of your body, if it's not good for you, then it doesn't become a part of you. But if you can't get it out of your body through your detoxification pathways, that's part of you. So we don't want bad things becoming a part of us. So you have specific detoxification pathways. That's what we're going to talk about. Your first one is maybe one of your more important ones, is your SOD pathway. Here they're showing 3. Now I think we have 13 in that pathway. SOD gene makes superoxide dismutase. Superoxide dismutase is a very important chemical in your body because what it does is it scavenges a specific free radical, meaning that it goes and grabs onto this free radical, superoxide, and it pulls it out of the body. That's the whole purpose of superoxide dismutase. Very important, because too many free radicals in our body could cause cancer, could cause fatigue, could cause all sorts of symptoms. So free radicals are bad, so I'm going to take a bunch of antioxidants. Superoxide dismutase is an antioxidant that's made in your body. It grabs onto superoxide and it turns it into hydrogen peroxide. And then glutathione, which we'll talk about in a little bit, grabs onto that along with catalase, turns it into water and gets it out of the body, and you urinate it out. Now, your body is making superoxide ion. Remember I said before that everything is about balance? You actually need free radicals in your body. Well, I thought you said free radicals are bad. Well, they are if you got too many of them. But not having free radicals is bad too. You actually make superoxide through the methionine pathway, but it's supposed to have a very short lifespan. So the half-life of superoxide is very short. Why? Because you're supposed to have really healthy superoxide dismutase genes that make a bunch of superoxide dismutase that get rid of it. So it does its job, it helps kill pathogens, and then your body gets rid of it. So very important. So if I have defects on my superoxide dismutase gene, I'm not making enough SOD. So I can have excess amounts of superoxide ions. Well, that's not good, because that could cause cancer, that could cause a whole bunch of different things. Well, the story gets even worse. If I have a chronic infection, like Lyme disease, then I have excess other chemical called inducible nitric oxide synthase. Sorry, this is where it gets really boring. But this excess nitric oxide readily bonds to excess superoxide. And it makes this really nasty guy called peroxynitrate. Peroxynitrate is extremely damaging to your endothelial cells. That's the cells that line your blood vessels. It's extremely damaging to all cells. It can damage the cell membrane. And even if I have really super healthy mitochondrial genes that we looked at just a second ago, the peroxynitrate is damaging the cell membranes, so those nutrients can't even get in. Peroxynitrate in excess may be the very cause of fibromyalgia type symptoms. It is one of the principal causes of heart disease. Heart disease is still the #1 cause of death in the United States. So, peroxynitrate formation and controlling peroxynitrate formation is extremely important. That's why I said this SOD gene is really important. Even if you don't have chronic Lyme, there's a lot of people dying of heart disease on a daily basis and they don't have chronic Lyme. However, that's why chronic other subacute, subclinical, meaning not ever diagnosed infections like H. pylori are the cause of heart disease solely through this very process. I shouldn't say that. There's another process that is involved too, but a big part of it is through peroxynitrate formation. Okay? Story gets worse. There's another gene called your NOS gene that's in a pathway called your biopterin pathway. And that NOS gene is responsible for another type of nitric oxide synthase called an endothelial nitric oxide synthase, and another one called neuronal nitric oxide synthase. That's for making nitric oxide in the brain for... Nitric oxide is actually a good guy. In the brain, for neuronal tissue, in the endothelial cells, it's a very good guy. Helps open up and relax the smooth muscles of the endothelial cells, helps you decrease high blood pressure. However, if you have superoxide ion floating around, it's attaching and forming peroxynitrate. If you have NOS defects, which we'll talk about in a little bit, you have uncoupled nitric oxide, which can bond to superoxide. So I know it sounds super complicated. I just lost half of you guys. But when you have SOD gene defects, you have to support these whether you have symptoms or not. Okay? So I don't have heart disease. I don't care. Okay? So I don't have fibromyalgia. I don't care. You have SOD gene defects, we're going to support this. Because most people that have heart disease, how do they know they have heart disease? They died. Okay? So it's not a good idea to wait till then. Does that make sense? So this is an important pathway to support. Here's the pathway if you like chemistry. I love chemistry. So superoxide dismutase gene. Every one of these genes needs different nutrients to push the gene pathway. This needs copper, zinc, and manganese to push this pathway. So one of the things, if I have a bunch of defects, I may want to use nutrients to help support that. Now the beauty is, some of these genes, you cannot give end products. Like if I have some defects in the methionine pathway, so I'm not making enough SAM, which we'll talk about in a bit, you can't just give SAM. You can buy it in the store, but I don't recommend using it. But SOD does not work on a negative feedback loop. So you can give a person straight SOD and catalase and glutathione to get rid of it completely out of the body. So here's SOD. It takes superoxide, that guy right there, and it gets rid of it, turns it into hydrogen peroxide. Then this is the glutathione cycle, and catalase that eventually turns it into water. It gets it out of the body. If you have excess, and excess nitric oxide, that's that NO, it makes this ONO, which is peroxynitrite. Easy peasy, right? Easy peasy. You got this down. So we want to support that pathway if you have defects on that. The glutathione pathway comes from the bottom half of that picture that I just showed. Glutathione is one of the cell's most important antioxidants. If you're not making enough glutathione, you're making all sorts of different things. So glutathione is essential to support this pathway as well. You got a question?
Yes, I missed the NOS defect. What does that lead to again?
So the NOS defect, so let's go back to our picture here. If I have excess superoxide, that's by itself a free radical that can damage cells. If I have excess free nitric oxide, which will come from a chronic infection, so if I have a chronic subclinical infection like H. pylori and I don't even know it, I'll have excess nitric oxide. If I have a known chronic infection like Lyme, I'll have excess nitric oxide. You couple those two problems together, SOD gene defects plus excess nitric oxide, that's how you produce excess peroxynitrite. You also get excess nitric oxide if you have NOS gene defects. So you might not have any chronic infection. I don't have H. pylori. I don't have Lyme. But I have NOS defects plus SOD gene defects. You have peroxynitrite formation.
And the NOS, what does that do one more time? That enzyme?
So the NOS gene is in the biopterin cycle. That makes endothelial nitric oxide. But if I have defects in that, I will have uncoupling of that and have excess nitric oxide free floating in the body. But there's three types of nitric oxide. Cytokine-inducible nitric oxide, which is going to be in a chronic infection, you're going to have ramped up that. So any chronic infection is going to cause excess nitric oxide. And then the endothelial, for the endothelial cells, and then neuronal. So those three forms. Glutathione is important. How to take that is important. You don't always want to take just glutathione. It's not really well absorbable. The new types of glutathione, S-acetylglutathione, are much better to be absorbed. But typically, I don't even use that. We use glutathione support because glutathione is recycled. And if you support that recycling of glutathione, sometimes that's the best way to do it. And catalase is the other gene that you want to look at. So if you look at the whole gene picture, then you could go, wow, this person definitely has problems with peroxynitrite or whatever you're trying to correct with this person. Does that make sense? Yes.
So if you took a liposomal glutathione, what are you doing in it?
So if you took liposomal glutathione, yeah, that's fine. That's another form of glutathione. But again, we don't want to just, we have to be careful too. Remember, too much of a good thing is a bad thing. So we don't want to just push one pathway. That's the danger of, oh, I had my MTHFR and I have a positive defect on 677, so I started taking 5 grams of folate and methylcobalamin B12. Is that a bad thing? Yeah, probably. Did you look at your biopterin pathway? Because folate is going to heavily push that. And if you have comp defects, I've had people call and say, I went on folate and methylcobalamin and I felt like I was going to kill somebody. Yeah, because your dopamine and serotonin went through the roof. You'll see that as we get to that. You have to be careful with too much of anything that you think is a good thing. Oh, glutathione, I read this book on glutathione, so I'm going to take, oh, it's glutathione, blah, 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 blah. These are all metabolic pathways that are just literally flying. And you're just going to feed one, it's going to throw things out. You have to be careful. Your cytochrome P450 pathway. So now we're in, this is detoxification pathways. This is mainly in your liver. Your cytochrome P450 pathway is your main primary detox, one of your main primary detox pathways in your liver. This person has not too ill, they got enough defects in there. So again, how do we get rid of poisons in our body? Through these pathways. If these pathways are compromised, we're going to have issues. This is interesting, this specific ABP1 gene was researched. This is how you get rid of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs in your body. Oh, I don't do good with Tylenol. I take Tylenol and I just feel sick. Yeah, well, you probably have this gene defect. Or, as a doctor, I'm going to look at that person's gene defect. No, they don't have that. But let's say they have a 2 there. So they have a double allele defect on that gene. I'm not going to prescribe those. They don't get rid of them very well. These are the people that take Advil or take Tylenol and they end up having liver failure because they can't detoxify it. Remember, you are what you don't detoxify. So if I have a patient that comes to me, says, I have stage 4 cancer and I did chemo and I just absolutely crashed. I don't know, I can't handle it. Okay, well, is it just because they emotionally can't handle it? Well, maybe there's a component of emotions in this, but you have to look at their metabolic pathways. They probably couldn't handle it because they have a whole bunch of cytochrome P450 pathway defects, this defect, and PON pathway defects we'll talk about in a second. They can't get rid of these chemicals very well. So, therefore, if you knew this before you decided to do some course of event, would it be a good idea? Hey, I can't do that drug because I don't get rid of it very well. Or I need to do a much lower dosage. In Ayurvedic medicine, these people are called Vata types, before we do anything about genetics. People that can take 1/5 the dosage of something, and that's all they can handle. Because they can't handle anymore. Well, most likely they have genetic defects in their ability to get rid of it. And if you dose them too high, you could hurt them, even with specific nutrients. Okay? So I've said before, one of the more difficult things that I have to do with a cancer patient or a Lyme patient is divorce them from everything that they're currently taking, this giant laundry basket full of supplements that they have. Too much of a good thing is a bad thing. You take something and you absorb it and your body can't use it, guess who has to detoxify it? Your liver. If you're overwhelming your liver detoxification pathways, even if they're perfectly open, those things are going to stay in your body and they can negatively affect you. So looking at your detoxification pathways can be extremely helpful. Your PON1 pathway is where you get rid of pesticides, insecticides, large chemicals. What happened there? I keep hitting buttons, but I'm not supposed to. Large chemicals and drugs you get rid of on the PON1 pathway. This person has a number of defects in there. They don't get rid of those very well. So this is where I say, you better not be spraying your lawn. You better not be, you better make sure you're eating the Clean 15 and staying away from the Dirty Dozen, or buying those organic. You better make sure you're not using insecticides and chemicals and fertilizers and all that garbage in your house. You're better off everybody's better off making those decisions, but definitely if you have compromise in your cytochrome P450 and your PON pathways and the NAT pathways that we're going to talk about in a little bit, you really have to watch those things even more so. And this is where you start getting into the question, do vaccinations cause autism? Because I don't believe it, but my neighbor believes it. Well, I don't really care what you believe. But the truth is, vaccinations and the things that are in a vaccination have to be detoxed through different pathways. If you have a 6-pound baby with PON1 pathways, cytochrome P450 pathways, and MTHFR pathway defects, you better believe they're going to cause problems. You can't be sane and not think that they're not going to cause problems. This child has no blood-brain barrier. That's not formed yet. So you take a 6-pound baby and you're going to inject all these adjuvants from this vaccination into them and not knowing what their genetic pathways are, well, you might as well just play Russian roulette. So I tell parents, okay, you're going to have a kid. Really good idea for you and your husband to get a 23andMe done. And then you can make an informed decision regardless of what you believe, whether vaccinations work or not. We won't get into that because I can talk about that for 5 hours. But if you know what your detoxification pathways are, you know whether you're going to get rid of it or not. Okay? So if the husband and the wife have a lot of defects in that, chance of that kid, just put up a little graph. Here's you. Well, you have a 2, so a 1 and a 1. Your husband has a 1. They have a 50% chance of having a 2. They have a 100% chance of having a 1. Do you want to take the chance? Maybe a different way to achieve immunization would be better. All right. Oh, I didn't know I had a slide on that. Your NAT pathways. Your NAT pathways are a specific genetic pathway that you get rid of, like everyday toxins like cigarette smoke and charcoal and everything that you're exposed to that is just everywhere. So you look at somebody who, I'm a smoker, I smoke 3 packs a day, and they have NAT pathways that look like that, their chance of lung cancer has gone up. So if you've known people, I've known people that lived to 105 years old, they smoked 5 packs of cigarettes a day, right? Why? Well, they probably didn't have any of those gene defects. Yes?
Would their children, because of their environmental exposure, would their children have more of a likelihood to have those defects?
So then you'll start asking the question, where did these defects come from? Was it because of the cigarette smoke that caused that defect, right? Very possibly. So their children might have a higher likelihood of having that defect. Yes. So further studies down the road are going to take place in that. So that's going to be interesting. Yeah, the epigenetic factors. You guys still with me?
Yep.
So only about half the people have fallen asleep so far, so that's good. So then you get into the methylation pathway. And this is what most doctors concern themselves with. So we're going to do an MTHFR test on you because that's what a genetic test is. And we haven't even begun to talk about that, have we? But this is the methylation pathway right here. If we looked at a chart, your body takes in folate from foliage, green leafy vegetables, goes through these different genes that we have to look at, and ultimately makes this thing right here, methyl tetrahydrofolate. Who's heard of that? Few people. And methyl tetrahydrofolate then goes into the methionine pathway and makes SAM. That's another life purpose that you have that you might not have known about. And it goes into the biopterin pathway to make all your neurotransmitters. So, your neurotransmitters. So, it's very important. So this folate pathway is really important. Methylation is the process of turning on and off genes to make certain enzymes for the gene to replicate, depending on what that gene does. It has to be methylated and unmethylated in order for that to turn on and off. So making methyl groups is very, very important for your body. If we have a deficiency of methyl tetrahydrofolate because of a dietary deficiency, which did occur at the beginning of the first few decades of the last century, the early 1900s, green leafy vegetables were not what city people were eating. They were eating cakes and breads and things like that, right? And they weren't eating whole wheat bread, they were eating white bread. Well, where do you get folate from? If you have a deficiency in folate, you're going to have a deficiency in methyl tetrahydrofolate, which is the active folate. And one of the things that it can occur if a woman carrying a baby has a deficiency, it could cause a neural tube defect. So women weren't eating any green leafy vegetables if you were a high-class woman. You were eating a lot of breads, and you certainly weren't eating that brown bread. You were eating white bread. There is folate in green leafy vegetables. There's also a little bit of folate in the wheat germ of the hull of the wheat. So when that was stripped off to make white bread, there was no folate in white bread. So people were grossly deficient in folate. So babies were being born with neural tube defects, and when it was discovered that it was folate, they created folate in the laboratory. It's called folic acid. So folic acid is synthetic folate. Now if you look at the back of your vitamin capsule bottle and it says folic acid and it doesn't say anything else, it's synthetic folate. Now it might say folic acid as folate or folic acid as 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate or folic acid as folinate. If it does that, then it's okay. If it just says folic acid and nothing else, or as folic acid, you should take that bottle of vitamins and throw it in the wastebasket. Synthetic folic acid will help prevent neural tube defects, but it is theorized that synthetic folic acid is the cause of the defect that is so pushed on the market, the MTHFR defect. So epigenetically, it's thought that folic acid is the cause of the methyl tetrahydrofolate defect. It doesn't work the same as folate. You should not be taking folic acid. So folate will turn into methyl tetrahydrofolate through this folate cycle. And then it's used in several other metabolic pathways. Still with me? This deep gene right down here, that MTHFR gene down at the bottom there, is so highly regarded because it was one of the first ones discovered, and there's a lot of research on it. There's 2 genes there in that family on that bubble there. The 1298 gene is thought that it mainly feeds the biopterin pathway to make neurotransmitters and neuronal and endothelial nitric oxide. And the C67 gene feeds the methionine cycle to make SAM, which is your main methyl transfer group in your body, to help turn genes on and off and for everything to work. So when I have a patient that comes to me and says, well, I have a homozygous defect on C677 MTHFR, so I'm going to die. No, you're not going to die, okay? And you probably shouldn't be taking a whole mess of imsumide. And I used to do this a long time ago too. So we're going to put the person on, because that used to be the only gene you could test. So we're going to put the person on methyl tetrahydrofolate. Well, the problem is that you push those pathways so rapidly, if they have defects in those other pathways, you can cause a whole mess of symptoms, literally. It could be a catastrophe. If you make too much neurotransmitters, you are going to have problems. In the case of the 2 children that I mentioned that were patients, if they would have taken, either one of them would have taken, and I don't remember if they were ever on it, would have taken methyl tetrahydrofolate or other methyl groups, they would have pushed dopamine production very strongly. These are the people that can become suicidal very rapidly or detrimental to society very rapidly. Excess dopamine and excess serotonin are going to cause very high levels of aggression. All right? Still with me? All right, so these are the genes in that pathway. We're not going to go over all of them. They're all important. And you see this person has an MTHFR C677, a single allele or heterozygous defect there. All right? So now, making SAM. So if I said ATP, making ATP is one of your life goals, making SAM is another life goal. You need to make SAM. If you don't make SAM, you're going to die. And that's made in this methionine pathway. So, starts right here, coming from MTHFR through this MTR gene. This is where you recycle B12. This is why the form of B12 is really important in what you're taking. We'll talk about that a little bit. You get into methionine here, and this is an amino acid that then converts ultimately to SAM. Methionine is really important for cancer patients because if we have MAT gene defects that converts methionine into SAM, then we can have excess methionine and cancer can feed off of methionine. So this is where when we talk about cancer diets and what are we going to put this cancer patient on? Oh, well, the Gerson protocol is going to put you on very high leucine and low meats, which is technically similar to a low methionine diet. So the Gerson protocol would probably be very good for a person who has MAT gene defects with excess methionine. But if the person doesn't have MAT gene defects, they don't need to be on a low methionine diet. Following? It's kind of confusing, but the more information that you have and the more you know, the more valuable this can be to a patient. Right? And again, maybe for the average person who doesn't really have much wrong with them, this isn't all that important. But when you're dealing with stage 4 cancer patients and Lyme patients that can't get better, all this stuff is super, super important. So looking at these pathways is really important. It's so important for you to make SAM, which I blurred it out on this picture right here because it's behind this little picture, that you make it through multiple pathways. You make it through recycling homocysteine, you make it through recycling choline, you make it through the MTHFR path that has to go through B12, and this is why B12 is so important in your body. But what form of B12 should I use? It depends on what gene defects that you have. So most people that are going to go on B12 just go to the store and say, hey, I need some B12, and will buy B12, or go to a practitioner and just go on this B12. It could be cyanocobalamin, which is not a good form of B12. It could be methylcobalamin, that's methyl groups, which you have to be really careful of, because if you push too many methyl groups on a person and they have defects in their biopterin pathway, which we haven't looked at yet, you'll push it really hard and you'll make excess serotonin and excess dopamine. So you can't do that. So then you have to go to what other forms of B12? Adenosylcobalamin? Yeah, that may be a good choice. Hydroxycobalamin? Yeah, that could be a good choice too. So looking at the gene profile helps you to get specific in how you're going to use supplementation for that person. So how are we going to support that gene defect? Well, this is going to be probably the best choice for you to help push this the right way.
Is hydroxy safe for just about anyone?
Hydroxy and adenosyl are safe for anyone. Either one of those, I would say, are safe for anyone.
Where do you find those?
On my shelf, that's where I find them. You can buy them, they're readily available. Either one of those are readily available. Hydroxycobalamin and adenosylcobalamin. Yeah, I mean, I maybe not in the normal health food store. I don't know. I haven't shopped there. Yes.
Will methylcobalamin turn mercury stored in your tissues to gas?
Will methylcobalamin turn mercury stored in your tissues to gas?
Mercury vapor.
I've never heard that. I've never seen any research on that. But you do have to be careful with methyl groups because they're going to push different pathways. So I'm not against methylcobalamin. I use it all the time, understand. And we use folate all the time, but you have to be careful looking at the whole big picture of the patient. Okay? And that is a key piece to overusing a supplement too. So if 1,000 micrograms of methylcobalamin is good, that doesn't mean 5,000 is better. That could be a lot worse. And I hate to say it, but these are metabolic pathways. And there's different needs that you have depending on the stress of the day, depending upon what you're going through from an emotional standpoint, physical standpoint. I or no one can say, oh, you need X amount of milligrams or micrograms of this nutrient based upon your genetics, based upon your organic acid test, based upon this. It changes with the wind. Now we do know that this might be a better supplement to take than this, but you have to get a good idea on how much you're supposed to take of that and the balance of that depending on your stress level. Yes?
Speaking of mercury, do you have any thoughts on how to detox mercury?
Speaking of mercury, do I have any thoughts on detoxing mercury? He's saying I have 3 minutes left. So yes, I have a lot of thoughts on that. So, but it's a complicated issue. But we should talk about it. But looking at those cytochrome P450 pathways, because that's where mercury is detoxed, is going to show compromise, right? So you want to support those pathways. So there are ways when those, I didn't talk about the detox pathway, to support those pathways. So there are certain products that will push that PON pathway. There are certain products that will push that cytochrome P450 pathway. And you want to support those pathways if you have defects on those pathways. This is where it gets to the gut again, because your liver could be doing a wonderful job and making these things water soluble, dumping them into the kidney, and you have kidney compromise because you have urea cycle defects, which we're going to talk about later, or dumping it into the colon, and because you have such horrible leaky gut, you're reabsorbing it right away again. Or because you're constipated and you're reabsorbing it into your colon, even if you don't have leaky gut. So you have to deal with the gut, at the same time at least. You can't have a person being constipated. This is where coffee enemas can help too. So we put almost all our cancer patients on coffee enemas because that will help pull stuff out of the liver. It'll help the cytochrome P450 pathways and it'll keep the person from being constipated a little bit too. Okay? We do have to break.